March is National Quilt Month, so this year we've hosted the 30th Annual Quilt Gala here at the Horry County Museum. We've also had a lot of programs throughout the month about fabrics and textiles and quilts, and we're really excited to tell you a little more about them. Today, we're going to talk about what you might call a common thread that runs through a lot of our collections here at the museum, and that's reclaimed fabric. So the most prominent example of the usage of reclaimed fabrics is in quilts. So today we're going to talk about the history of quilts. The word quilt comes from the Latin word quilcita, which means stuffed sack. And the idea of having a blanket or a garment that features a padding or some sort of insulated layer sandwiched between two layers of fabric is not new. There are examples dating back as far as the Middle Ages. But the idea of quilts as we know them today really started in the United States, and before that in the British colonies in North America. In those days, people didn't have a lot of extra fabric to work with. So what they would do is if a blanket started to get worn out, then they would take another blanket or a shirt that they couldn't wear anymore because it was worn out or because it was torn, and they would take the pieces of it that were still good and patch their blanket that was starting to come apart. And the pieces of fabric that were too worn to use could be used inside of the blanket as that kind of padding or insulated layer. And over time, the idea of patching blankets with pieces of extra fabric that clearly came from other blankets or other garments evolved into what we know as patchwork quilts. And we see that over time, quilting goes from a necessity of patching blankets with whatever was on hand to what we today call an American folk art. And what really changed this and helped elevate it to the style of quilting we know today was the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution comes, this brings a wide variety of fabrics that are not only stronger, but also have a wider variety of colors and patterns. And we're going to see some examples of that from our collection. One example of a quilt made of reclaimed fabrics in our collections is this suit quilt. It's named so because it's made out of pieces of old men's suits. Before the late 20th century, most men wore suits a lot more frequently than most men do now. You don't see suits with synthetic fabrics until a few decades after World War II. So suits before then would have been made almost entirely of wool, and they would have made very good warm material to make a quilt out of. You may also notice it has some strings sticking out of it at different points that are different colors. That's because unlike most of the quilts in our collection, which are sewn, this is a tie quilt. When a quilt is put together, the quilter sews through all three layers of fabric to make sure that the three layers don't flop around and lose heat. But some older quilts, instead of sewing through all three layers, what the quilter will do is pierce through all three layers of fabric and then take a piece of string or sturdy yarn and then tie a little knot through it. And they tie a whole bunch of these all over the quilt in order to make sure that the layers aren't flopping around like that. This also has the added effect, according to some quilters, of making the quilt feel lighter and fluffier. So this is not only interesting because of what it's made of, but also how it's made. One of the other really famous examples of something made of reclaimed fabric would be the myriad of things made out of feed sacks. Now, the most famous example is right here, the feed sack dresses of the Great Depression. Feed companies that sold livestock feed to farmers and ranchers started selling their products in cloth bags around the turn of the 20th century. And what they noticed was that people would use this tightly woven, lightweight cloth to sew with. And during the Great Depression, what these companies realized was that a lot of people were starting to make clothing out of them, especially children's clothes because they require less material. So companies actually partnered with fashion magazines and companies that made patterns that people used when they were sewing with sewing machines to create fabrics that looked like these, that have bright colors and bright designs. Whereas older feed sacks would probably just be one color, probably white, and they might have had the company logo on it, and that probably would have been it. So what you see then during the Great Depression is feed sacks like these not only help differentiate brands, which all functionally sell the same thing, but they also encourage brand loyalty. Because if a customer wanted more fabric to work with, they would have to buy more bags of feed from the same company because the patterns were unique from company to company. Every March here at the Horry County Museum, we celebrate National Quilt Month by having a wide variety of speakers and workshops and programs all about fabrics and textiles and quilts. And if you can't make it to see us in March, if you come the rest of the year, the room that I'm currently in now is our textile gallery. And every so often we come in and we switch out the quilts and some of the clothing in here. So the room may not look exactly like this when you get here, but I guarantee you'll be able to learn a lot about the textile history of Horry County. So thanks again for watching the video, and have a great day.